So tonight we are going to talk about issues happening in Haiti and Cuba. So very timely and relevant in the news right now. We have Dr. David Goldberg with us. He's a political science professor at College of DuPage and an expert in Caribbean and Latin American politics. And he's going to discuss the recent events and historical context of Haiti's current crisis, and he'll evaluate the possibilities going forward. And he'll also discuss some of the recent events happening in Cuba in the historical perspective. So thank you so much, Dr. Goldberg. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Courtney, for the introduction and for the invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to your patrons and community members about these important events that are taking place and have been taking place over the course of the summer. So I do have a PowerPoint, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Cuba and more about Haiti, and then have, as Courtney mentioned, please feel free to put questions in the chat box. And if I don't catch them right away, you can feel free to interrupt. I'm very informal about this. I can also go and go through my sort of summary of events, and then sort of have some general conclusions that we can talk about, and you can certainly weigh in and ask questions and tell me what you think as we get there. So I can be flexible in terms of how this works as well as informal, but I do want to share my screen with you so that you can see the PowerPoint that I'm pulling from. Whoops, excuse me. So what I really want to talk about, did I lose my, okay, sorry. These two countries in the Caribbean that have somewhat dissimilar paths with a little bit of overlap, right? So Cuba was a Spanish colony until the Spanish-American War in 1896, and got sort of nominal sovereignty that really wasn't very sovereign as the United States sort of expanded its influence across the Caribbean, across the region in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. And Haiti, that had been, well, the entire island had been a Spanish colony, then also a French colony, and got their independence very early on in the 19th century. And I think that's very important from a US perspective, because that occurred early on in the 19th century at a time when slavery was still very prevalent in the United States, and even before the UK had banned the transatlantic slave trade. And so the idea that a colony, a French colony made up of slaves, could overthrow and govern themselves was a real wake-up call, I think, in the Atlantic and in the Western Hemisphere. Subsequent to that, we usually associate Haiti with instability, and I'll talk more about the sort of recent roots of that, recent context of that. And then in Cuba, most people are aware in 1959, there was a revolution in which Fidel Castro took power, and Cuba and the Soviet Union forged an alliance. And while the United States and Cuba had been very close allies prior to that, from 1959 really up to the present administration, the US sanctions against the Cuban economy have been very detrimental and damaging to the Cuban economy, but did not have the effect of overthrowing the communist regime that's been in power since 1959. So I think that's the thumbnail sketch of 2 centuries of history in 3 minutes. I think what I'm more interested in, and what I think is hopefully something that we can talk about, is how COVID has laid bare some of the existing inequities in our own society, around the world, and certainly in Latin America and the Caribbean. And so I think part of what's going on in both of these places can be explained by that. When we look at either high infection rates and a spread in Cuba, but also very low vaccination rates in Haiti, on top of this sort of last 12 years, more or less, of political instability in the aftermath of the 2010 earthquake. So that's kind of where I'm looking to go and fill in the blanks and sort of talk about this in a little bit more detail, some of these recent events and how I think we can explain them, and not knowing what's going to happen, what's going to go forward. So the picture on the left is from a protest in Cuba that took place the 3rd week in July, and I have actually the link to this article. This is from the New York Times to appropriately credit the source. I think this is really, really important because while Cuba has been a very repressive state since 1959, it's been a fairly stable place because of that repression in part. And so what that means is that the political apparatus of the dominant party has been very effective down to the local level, like block by block, in terms of repressing dissent and opposition. And so the fact that in this picture you had over 700 people that came out in public to protest, the protest in part what has been an economic crisis across the country. And that crisis sort of waxes and wanes since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990. When things were really bad in the 1990s, it's called the special period, where chronic food shortages, really. People have to stand in line for long lines in order to get basic foodstuffs that we take for granted in the United States, and that sort of harkens back to a Cold War, Eastern Europe, Soviet era period that still exists in Cuba. So the fact that hundreds of people took to the streets publicly to protest is virtually unprecedented in the 21st century in Cuba. So it's hard to overstate the significance of what's taken place. And I think that this is the result of a couple different things, this growing economic crisis. So I'll stop there and I'll talk more about Cuba in a second, but I just want to show you the picture on the right is one that I took in Port-au-Prince in 2009. I was there briefly for a stay about clean water. And this was the presidential palace. And this palace was destroyed by the earthquake in 2010. So that's the picture on the right there in Port-au-Prince, the capital of Haiti. So jumping back to Cuba, what was happening in July is that there was a wave of COVID cases estimated as high as 8,000 per day. And that there were 5 high-ranking generals who were advanced in age, in fairness, many of whom had their credibility, their legitimacy as a result of the Cuban Revolution would be the context of that. And they died under very mysterious circumstances. Now, you have to bear in mind, as I assume most people are aware, that information is at a premium in Cuba. And so the cause of death was not revealed for these 5 generals as COVID, but given the high rate of infection and the cases that were spreading, that was thought what it was related to. So in the absence of transparent information, people fill in the blanks in terms of trying to explain what would have accounted for these deaths. So as people took to the streets to protest an economic crisis, and again, because Cuba is an authoritarian state in which everything is controlled by the state, from your employment to where you live, foodstuffs, everything, that means that information as well, there was a crackdown on the internet as people took to the streets to express their dissatisfaction. So I think it's this combination of the spread of the disease across the island, and the Caribbean in general had relatively low vaccination rates. And in some places, COVID ravaged the Caribbean quite significantly. So that led to a crackdown in which hundreds of people have been imprisoned, have been detained and imprisoned. And their whereabouts at times are unclear. If they're going to be charged, if they're going to be put in prison for a long period of time, or if they're just going to be detained in the short term. The other piece of that was a crackdown on the internet. So in Cuba and Myanmar and Iran and other places where there are authoritarian states, internet, again, the flow of information via computers is controlled by the state. And so it's much easier to crack down on internet. And the internet, we know, in the past several decades has become an organizing focal point for political opposition around the world, be it apps or be it social media, be it Twitter, to a lesser extent Instagram, but also YouTube was used in Iran in the past and other places. So cracking down on the internet makes that much more difficult for people of like-minded views in terms of their criticism of the state to make it more difficult for them to communicate with one another. And if they have to do it face-to-face, that increases the likelihood that they could be arrested or that their behavior could be monitored by elements of the state. I think that this reveals a real crisis of legitimacy in Cuba, that they actually brought out Raul Castro, who I believe is 90 now. So that's Fidel's brother, who ran the country after Fidel's death and has retired a few years ago, maybe a little bit less, and is still alive. But they brought him out, which is an indication of how seriously the regime took these protests. They don't see that a lot. So other than a wave of repression, they don't really have a lot of means to address that. So this has died down because Cuba is, all things considered, a reasonably small country, and the state is very, very strong. And so as a result of that state presence and state power, it's easier to put thousands of people or hundreds of people, in this case, in jail, and sort of catch the ringleaders and find out what they're going to do about that from there. So for now, it seems like the last couple of weeks, the protests and coverage of this in Cuba has been lessened, right? I mean, I think the context of this in terms of US foreign policy has been in the end of the Obama administration, there was a thawing of relations with Cuba. Things seem to be moving in a direction towards having greater economic ties and certainly making it easier for Cubans living in the United States to be able to travel back to Cuba to bring scarce goods to family members in Cuba, to make it easier for academics to go. A former colleague of mine whose wife taught literature at DePaul was able to go a few years ago, and so that was made easier. The cultural exchanges that sort of wax and wane by administration were easier under the Obama administration. The Trump administration and bipartisan, really Democrats, Republicans, although we typically think about Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, as being in the news and social media a lot about this. We're very, very critical of this and have been at the forefront of criticizing what's going on. So in the Trump administration, there was a kind of a tightening of those reins, right? If it's there was an increase in cultural exchanges and discussions about trade relations and even diplomatic relations, that really was went in a different direction to the Trump administration. So again, the backdrop of this is the sanctions that the United States brought against Cuba, in part because it was getting basically $1 billion a year in assistance from the Soviets, who bought sugar from Cuba and then provided economic, military, and intelligence assistance to Cuba in exchange for their loyalty. And so since then, since that period of time, the United States has had an economic embargo, which means it's illegal to buy and sell goods in Cuba. And if you want to travel to Cuba, you have to get it's illegal to spend dollars in Cuba. So a couple of years ago, I was in the Caribbean nation state of Trinidad and Tobago, which is near Venezuela. And the school that I was at, University of the West Indies, was taking a group of their students to go to Cuba. I was there for a semester. And so I had applied for a license from the Treasury Department to go to Cuba as part of this exchange, because I didn't wish I was there on a Fulbright exchange. I didn't wish to jeopardize what I was there to do for this. So I was waiting to hear back from the Treasury Department about my license. My license was approved at the end of my semester stay, and after the students had already come and gone, right? So my point is that it's a long, onerous process at the time. This was in 2009, and that in order to travel to Cuba as an academic, you had to be able to show that there was research that you could only do in person, right? So that be it interviews or anthropological stuff or social scientific stuff, that you could only conduct that research face to face. So it had to be extraordinary circumstances, a very high bar to meet in order to qualify to go there. And while ultimately I was approved, it was after the student exchange had already taken place at the school where I was teaching. I think that's sort of, symbolic of how difficult it has been for academics and for students to engage in legitimate cultural exchange. So the Biden administration has taken, I think, a more relaxed approach than the Trump administration, but given what's going on in other aspects of US foreign policy, this has taken a backseat. This is not a priority, to my mind, for the Biden administration to forge better relations with Cuba or to talk about lifting the sanctions. And instead, what we hear about is a strange illness. It's called Havana syndrome. So the United States doesn't have diplomatic relations with Cuba, that we do have an interest section for US diplomats, which has largely been a place to disseminate US perspectives on what's going on in Cuba. And many diplomats who have served at the intersection in Havana were targeted by some sort of unknown phenomenon that affected perception, so hearing in particular. So if you want to know more about that, look up Havana syndrome, and the people that have served there are experiencing some extraordinary, debilitating kinds of sensory, I don't know if I should call it a disease or a disability. I'm not actually sure how to describe it in that way. But this is these little stories, these little anecdotes, I think are symbolic of this relationship and what's going on. So the crisis of political legitimacy is one that will not be resolved anytime soon. And I think that when there is more repression, that simply can no longer be justified under the mantle of political legitimacy that the Cuban Revolution created, right? To put it another way, Castro was able to criticize the United States and to criticize Cuban exiles who went to Florida and elsewhere as saying these are people that want to overthrow the revolution, and therefore the country has to come together to oppose that. And I think the 1959 revolution, the Bay of Pigs invasion, other sort of ill-conceived covert operations really did have a cohesive effect in terms of shaping and helping the Castro regime build legitimacy. But I think, as was the case in the Soviet Union, the legitimacy that's gained from that revolution can only be eventually over time it erodes, right? So they were able to talk and I think sincerely to trumpet successes in education and in access to medicine, things that didn't occur under the other Batista regime in the past prior to 1959. But again, that's not enough to sort of create the structure, the infrastructure of legitimacy that a government needs that's not relying on the things that other countries might rely on, including free and fair elections and civil society and a press and a rich civil society, that those things are absent or state controlled in Cuba. So I'm not sure where that's going to go in the sense of if this is a one-off, right? If these protests that we've seen in the past month and a half are something larger, or if they can be squelched by the state with these arrests and cracking down on social media. So moving on to Haiti, and I think I have maybe like 10, 15 more minutes in terms of my comments at the most, that before I would open it up to questions. So I know a little bit more, my own experience, my own research is more about Haiti than it is about Cuba. I became interested in the spread of democratic norms across the hemisphere with Latin America and the Caribbean when I was in graduate school many moons ago. And over time, I was interested in international organizations that are observing elections. So in the hemisphere, that is the Organization of American States, but it's also, there's a Caribbean one in particular that addresses those issues. And so because since Haiti has returned to civilian rule after 1986, there's been a number of elections, many of which have sort of unintended negative consequences for Haiti. And that has gotten the attention of the United States at times. I think I mentioned the United States growing presence in terms of U.S. foreign policy in the 20th century in Haiti, but the fact that there are U.S. Marines that occupy Haiti from 1915 to 1934 is of note, right? This is worth mentioning that there's a history of this. So what got everybody's attention most recently is that Jovenel Moïse, who was the president, was assassinated on July 7th, 2021. By a series of, at the time, what were known as unknown assailants. So I was out of town, actually. I was in the West and I wasn't paying that close of attention to what was going on. And I had a friend who had lived in the Dominican Republic, and we were supposed to be getting together later on in July. And he said, I can't wait to hear what you think about what's going on in Haiti. And I had no idea. And so suddenly I got on the internet and started looking at the sources that I look at to try to find out what was going on. And so Moïse was killed in the first week in July. And if you follow this at all, you you won't be surprised that the initial reports were that there were more than 24 Colombian mercenaries that identified themselves as DEA agents, that these were Drug Enforcement Agency officials. And there were recordings of this, right? Because the presidential palace that had been overrun by these more than 24, 29, I think is the number, of mercenaries that had come from Colombia in June. So they'd been planning. And the attacks, I mean, what's emerged in the last month is that the attack seems to have been with the, complicit involvement of the president's security detail. The president was killed and his wife was shot and injured severely, but it looked like the initial reports and subsequent were that people who were supposed to be protecting the president and defending him were quick to turn and run and did not exchange fire all that much and were not injured, suggesting that this was something of an inside job. So the thing about Moïse is that he was elected in 2017 and had overstayed his term by a year. And in order to understand that, we got to sort of understand what was going on in Haiti before that, and I'll talk about that in a second on the next slide. So there's a couple of good stories in the New York Times recently about the growth of Colombian mercenaries, who were special forces, where there was a long-standing civil war in Colombia between basically right-wing governments and left-wing guerrillas. And so there's this sort of trained cadre of officers and enlisted men who have a very special skill set for which there is a demand. So Haiti, the reason why I'm mentioning this in part is because President Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who was elected in the late 80s and then again in the 90s, one of the things that he did was he dissolved the Haitian military. And so there was no standing army. And then a subsequent president tried to bring it back. So while there's a police force, the police force had been poorly equipped and poorly trained and was not in a position to defend the country, address national security concerns, as well as just criminal justice concerns, especially in the face of narco trafficking, right? So in my first slide, I talked about Haiti as a fragile state. Excuse me. And by that, I mean criminal elements, gangs internal in Port-au-Prince, but also outside, could bribe high-ranking officials and basically bring in cargo planes full of narcotics. This is not a new phenomenon in Haiti. There was a previous director of the Haitian National Police Force who'd been indicted in federal court in Miami for doing just that, for using HNP, Haitian National Police forces, to shut down an airstrip so that cartel forces could bring in a tremendous amount of narcotics. So that has, as you might not be surprised to find out, a very corrosive effect on political institutions in a country that is already fragile economically and politically. So there was a report of a doctor living in Florida who was thought to be behind some of these initial reports around the assassination of the president. So let me just provide a little bit of context about this, and I'll kind of begin to sum up my comments here, and we can open it up to questions. So I said I was there I was in Trinidad and Tobago in 2009. I was in Haiti in 2007. And there in 2010, there was an earthquake of unprecedented magnitude in the Caribbean that killed about 200,000 Haitians and leveled a lot of Port-au-Prince. And Haiti's a place that, especially Port-au-Prince, which was on the ocean, doesn't have a lot of clean water and doesn't have a grid system, electrical grid and water system, the way that you and I are accustomed to it if you've grown up in this country. And so those existing infrastructure issues were made so much worse by this, because it made it much more difficult to help people and to triage. That was also made all the worse by the fact that in the aftermath of the earthquake, the UN Security Council authorized a peacekeeping force, and there'd been a series of peacekeeping forces to go in and help the country in the aftermath of the earthquake. The problem was that some of the peacekeeping troops that had come from Northern Asia brought with them a strain of cholera that the island had never seen before. So on top of the horror of the earthquake that killed 200,000 people, about another 10,000 people have lost their lives because of a cholera outbreak linked to these UN peacekeepers that were not abiding by appropriate hygiene protocols to deal with human waste, right? And so that seemed to make things worse. It also made it worse because the UN peacekeeping forces that should ideally inspire some trust and hope in the populations that they're there to serve were in fact spreading this disease unintentionally, right? So moving forward a little bit to the unrest of what's been going on in Haiti, is that former Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, who died a few years ago, one of the things that Venezuela had a lot of was oil. And so he sort of came up with this regional development plan that he thought would compete with Western financial institutions. It was called Petrocaribe. And what that meant was that Chavez would sell countries oil at a very low rate and also give them the energy infrastructure to do what they needed to do with that oil at below market interest rates, much cheaper than what it would be if they were buying and selling on open markets. Now, Chavez did that because he thought that those countries would also then adopt his ideological program, right? That they would be more sympathetic to his political agenda because of his economic generosity, if you will. So in the case of Haiti, that meant about $200 million in money that went from Venezuela to Haiti. On top of this, in fairness, I should say that Venezuela canceled a whole bunch of debt that Haiti owed to Venezuela after the earthquake. But there's about $200 million that were not accounted for. And so this was a huge scandal in the last 3 or 4 years in Haiti about the government's responsibility, who absorbed this $200 million from the Venezuelan government as part of this Petrocaribe project, but didn't have much to show for it. There was not an increase in the energy sector, either in terms of cheaper energy, more readily available energy, or energy implications for the economy in terms of the creation of new jobs. None of that seemed to exist. So this was one in a series of scandals in the aftermath of the earthquake that people began to take to the streets for and to protest the corruption from the previous president, whose name was Manley, who was thought to be responsible for some of this, that had allegedly, been responsible for pocketing some of this money. So there is this context of both political instability and economic unrest in Haiti that certainly predates 2010. But I think that's the most recent. These are the precursor events, and then sort of what's going on right now. So one of the members of the legislature has stepped in, and his name is Avril, and he's going to be serving. He's the prime minister. They have a system that is both presidential and prime minister. Some countries have that. And elections have been scheduled for next month in Haiti. There's sort of always this question about whether you could have free and fair presidential elections against this backdrop, right? Not just in Haiti, but in other countries, Afghanistan, and even Iraq as well, right? Can you have free and fair political elections when there's so much unrest, uncertainty, and frankly, human suffering? So let me move on to sort of my conclusion. My summary comments are, I think across the region, across Latin America and the Caribbean, we've seen the rise of what's often called populism and nationalism. And Brazil is the best case of this, right? So there's the president of Brazil's name is Jair Bolsonaro, and he is going to be in a tough re-election bid. But Bolsonaro kind of apes or mimics this populist nationalist trend that we've seen in other places. I would say turn your attention to Viktor Orban in Hungary, to a certain extent Putin in Russia, and certainly Duterte in the Philippines, who have sort of created this populist nationalist rhetoric that's a rejection of globalism, loosely defined, as well as this sort of regime of human rights and international law that's basically since World War II, right? This is this is the crux of my international relations class of what we're talking about these days. So I'm sort of summarizing this briefly, but I think we see the rise of populism and nationalism. Most people date this to Brexit. So 6 years ago, the decision by voters in the UK to withdraw from the European Union as the kind of the starting point. The clock starts. As I'm saying, this is happening in far-flung parts of the world, and certainly Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil is one of these. People are arguing that he may not be reelected, and that he has said that he wouldn't rule out a coup, a military coup. So Brazil had a coup from 1964, a military junta that ruled the country from 1964 to 1985, and so they have been democratic since 1985. So to have a democratically elected president come forward and say, I wouldn't rule out a military coup if I lose the election, was quite jarring. I mention this because COVID has run amok in Brazil. Bolsonaro got it and was sick. People in his cabinet got it and were sick. He sort of underplayed it and underemphasized it in terms of public health protocols, but also politically as well. So again, I think what my theme is that you have these political infrastructure and economic inequalities that are bad enough. And that what COVID has done is to show those weaknesses, it's to shine a very bright light on those weaknesses and those problems. And I don't know where that will go in 2 years or 5 years, not just in terms of elections and whether people like Orban and Bolsonaro will win re-election, but also what this means for the public health infrastructure in these places. Will there be a full-throated effort by the WHO, by the IMF and the World Bank to get vaccinations spread? The United States has been a part of this in terms of making more vaccinations available in different parts of the developing world. I think that this will be a very interesting test in terms of cooperation on this matter.
So thank you so much for being here with us tonight, Dr. Goldberg, and thank you all for coming, and have a wonderful night, everyone.